The first sensation was cold, not the ambient chill of a room, but a deep, cellular cold that seeped into the marrow of his bones, a remnant of the cryostasis from which he had been violently torn. Sound followed, a high-frequency scream of tearing metal and the percussive, deafening roar of an engine in its death throes. He was suspended, held fast by restraints that bit into his thin tunic, the world outside his transport pod a chaotic blur of fire and fractured earth. His designation, 0734, flickered on a cracked display panel near his head, a final stuttering reminder of what he was, an asset, a tool, property of the Enclave Directorate. He was not a person. He had been told this so many times it had become a foundational truth, a load-bearing wall in the sterile architecture of his existence. The pod slammed into the ground, and the impact was a physical blow that ripped the air from his lungs. Darkness, star-pricked and absolute, consumed him for a moment. When consciousness returned, it brought with it a new, terrifying awareness. The automated systems were failing. The soft hiss of the suppressant dispenser had ceased. For 17 years, that sound had been the rhythm of his life, a constant vaporous presence that kept his biology muted, his instincts caged, his omega nature a theoretical concept rather than a lived reality. Now, silence, a profound, unnerving silence in its place. He could feel a strange, unfamiliar heat beginning to coil deep in his belly, a slow thawing nerve coming back to life. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through the fog of his concussion. Without the suppressants, he was exposed. A signal, a beacon in the wilderness for things he could not name, things the Enclave had trained him to fear. A groan of stressed metal echoed around him, and the pod's fractured canopy finally gave way, peeling open like a grotesque metal flower. The air that rushed in was an assault. It was thick, heavy with the scent of pine needles, damp soil, and something wild and alive. It was too much. After a lifetime of recycled, sterilized air, the raw, organic perfume of the world was a physical weight, pressing down, suffocating. He choked, his senses reeling from the sudden, violent overload. And then, another scent cut through the chaos. Ozone, ash, and something else. Something primal and dominant, laced with the metallic tang of blood. It was sharp, commanding, and it silenced the frantic thrumming in his own veins with an authority that was absolute. Alpha. A shadow fell over the opening of his pod. A figure, silhouetted against the burning wreckage, stood there, impossibly large. The man was clad in dark, functional tactical gear, scarred and stained with soot. A helmet obscured his features, its polished black visor reflecting the dancing flames, a soulless, insectoid gaze. He moved with a predator's economy of motion, his presence a tangible force that seemed to bend the very air around him. Kalen, a name he barely remembered, a ghost of a self buried under years of conditioning, pressed himself back against the cold interior of the pod, a whimper dying in his throat. This was a warrior, an alpha of a caliber he had only seen in training simulations, the kind designed to hunt and neutralize threats. And Kalen, with his suppressants failing, was about to become the most potent threat in this desolate landscape. The alpha reached into the pod, his movements precise and unhurried. Gloved fingers, surprisingly gentle, found the release mechanism for Kalen's restraints. A soft click, and the pressure on his chest vanished. Kalen didn't move. He couldn't. His body was a trembling, useless thing, caught between the ingrained obedience of his training and the burgeoning, terrified instinct of his awakening biology. The Alpha paused, his helmeted head tilting slightly, as if listening to something Kalen couldn't hear. Then he spoke, his voice a low, gravelly timbre, filtered through the helmet's comms, but losing none of its resonant power. "You are O734, he stated. It wasn't a question. He knew. Of course he knew. He was probably Directorate Special Forces, a recovery unit, but his armor bore no insignia, no identifying marks. He was a ghost. "Protocol dictates I terminate compromised assets," the Alpha continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Kalen's heart seized. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the killing blow, the cold finality he had been programmed to accept. But it didn't come. Instead, a hand, large and warm even through the tactical glove, cupped the back of his neck. The touch was electric, a shock that jolted through every nerve ending. It was the first human contact he could remember that wasn't clinical, corrective, or violent. It was firm, grounding, and terrifyingly intimate. "But protocol has become inefficient," the Alpha murmured, more to himself than to Kalen. He leaned closer, and the scent of him intensified, a complex, smoky aroma of cedarwood, worn leather, and something uniquely, powerfully his. It made the air in Kalen's lungs feel thin, made the nascent heat inside him flicker and burn brighter. With an effortless strength, the Alpha pulled him from the wreckage. Kalen's legs, weak from stasis and the crash, gave way, and he would have collapsed if not for the iron grip that held him upright. The Alpha supported his weight easily, one arm wrapped around his slender waist, holding him flush against a chest that felt like solid rock. The proximity was dizzying. Kalen could feel the thrum of the man's heartbeat, a slow, steady rhythm against his ear. He was being held, cradled, protected. It was a sensation so alien it bordered on painful. He was an asset. He was not meant to be protected. He was meant to be used and discarded. The Alpha began to move, carrying him away from the inferno of the crash site and into the deep, swallowing darkness of the forest. The trees rose around them like the pillars of some ancient, forgotten temple. The sounds of the wilderness, once a terrifying cacophony, began to resolve into individual notes. The chirp of a night creature, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant cry of a predator. With every step, the Alpha's scent seemed to permeate him further, a living, breathing thing that wrapped around him like a shield. It calmed the rising tide of his panic, soothing the raw, frayed edges of his nerves. He found himself leaning into the solid warmth of the Alpha's body, a desperate, unconscious seeking of sanctuary. They stopped in a small, sheltered clearing, hidden by a granite overhang. The Alpha gently set him down, his back against the cold stone. Kalen slid to the ground, his limbs still trembling. The warrior knelt before him, a dark, imposing silhouette. He reached up and, with a soft hiss of depressurizing seals, removed his helmet. The face that was revealed was not what Kalen had expected. It was a landscape of harsh lines and stark plains, framed by short, dark hair. A jagged scar sliced through his left eyebrow and down his cheek, a pale, silvered line against his tanned skin. His eyes, a startlingly intense shade of grey, like a storm-tossed sea, fixed on Kalen. They were old eyes, filled with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. They held no malice, no cruelty, only a profound, chilling resolve. "The Enclave will be hunting you," the Alpha said, his voice raw and unfiltered now, deeper than Kalen had imagined. "Your biosignature is flaring. Without suppressants, you're a lighthouse in the dark. They will find you within a day. Kalen knew this. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through him. He would be recaptured, reconditioned, or dissected to see what had gone wrong. "I can hide you," the Alpha continued, his gaze unwavering. "I can mask your scent, confuse their trackers. I can keep you alive." Hope, a fragile, unfamiliar emotion, fluttered in Kalen's chest. It was a foolish, dangerous thing to feel. He was 0734. Hope was not part of his programming. "Why?" Kalen whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Why would you help me?" The Alpha's expression didn't change, but something flickered in the depths of his storm-gray eyes. A shadow of a memory, perhaps, a ghost of a pain Kalen couldn't comprehend. "Because I was once a designation too," he said softly. The words hung in the air between them, a confession that reordered Kalen's entire understanding of the world. This man, this powerful, self-possessed Alpha, had come from the same sterile hell. He had escaped. He reached into a pouch on his belt and produced a small silver canister, a medical kit. He began to clean the cut on Kalen's temple with an antiseptic wipe. The sting was sharp, but it was the gentleness of the gesture that made Kalen flinch. No one had ever tended to him this way. He was serviced, maintained, but never cared for. "My help is not free," the Alpha said, his voice dropping lower, pulling Kalen's attention back to his intense gaze. The fragile hope in Kalen's chest withered, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. Of course, there was always a price. The Directorate had taught him that lesson well. Everything was a transaction. "What do you want?" Kalen asked, the words barely audible. He had nothing. He was nothing. A broken piece of equipment lying in the dirt. The Alpha finished cleaning the cut and applied a small bioadhesive bandage. His fingers lingered for a moment on Kalen's skin, calloused and warm. The touch sent a shiver through him, a tremor that had nothing to do with the cold. "To mask your scent, I need to overlay it with my own. A temporary measure won't be enough. The Enclave's trackers are too sophisticated. They can pass scent layers. It needs to be a complete integration, a merging of bio-signatures." He paused, letting the clinical words sink in. Kalen's mind, trained in the cold logic of the Enclave's science divisions, understood the implication before the Alpha even said it. He felt the blood drain from his face. There was only one way to achieve that level of integration. "I saved your life," the Alpha stated, his voice a quiet, unyielding declaration. "And now I require payment." He held Kalen's gaze, his storm-gray eyes pinning him in place. There was no lust in them, no predatory hunger. There was only a stark, pragmatic finality. It was a soldier's assessment, a tactical decision. It was, in its own way, as cold and clinical as any directive Kalen had ever received. "I demand your bond." The words echoed in the silent clearing, more devastating than any explosion. The bond, the deepest, most sacred connection an Omega could form, the merging of soul and biology that the Enclave had dismissed as a primitive, inefficient relic. For them, it was a flaw to be engineered out. For Kalen, it was a mythical, impossible concept, a fairy tale whispered in the dark corners of his mind. And this stranger, this scarred warrior who had pulled him from the fire, was demanding it as payment for his life. Not asking, not offering, demanding. It was not a proposal. It was a sentence. He had been saved from one cage only to be offered another. A gilded cage, perhaps, scented with cedar wood and promised safety. But a cage nonetheless. The heat in his belly, which had been a nascent flicker of life, now felt like a brand, marking him as property once more. The choice was simple: a quick death at the hands of the Enclave, or a life indebted to the Alpha who held his fate in his hands. He looked into those stormy eyes and saw no room for negotiation. He saw only the cold, hard truth of his new reality. He had been saved. And now, the price was due. The silence that followed the Alpha's demand was a living thing, a heavy blanket woven from the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a lone wolf. Kalen's mind raced, a frantic scramble through the wreckage of his conditioning. The bond was an abstraction, a piece of forbidden law. The Directorate taught that it was a biological vulnerability, a subroutine of primitive instinct that compromised an asset's operational efficiency. To them, an Omega's heat was a fever to be suppressed, their scent a liability to be masked, and their capacity to bond a flaw to be eradicated. He had been raised in a world that had surgically removed his nature, leaving behind a hollowed-out obedience. And now, this man, this stranger, was demanding he resurrect that buried part of himself and hand it over. A bond is not a transaction, Kalen managed to say, the words feeling clumsy and foreign on his tongue. He was quoting from a forbidden text, a fragment of pre-Enclave literature he'd once accessed through a data breach, a moment of rebellion so small and secret he had almost convinced himself it never happened. The text had spoken of mutuality, of emotion, of a resonance between two souls. It had described the bond as a symphony, not a contract. The Alpha's expression remained unreadable, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. In this world, everything is a transaction, Omega. Your life for your bond. It is the purest form of trade there is. Survival. I am offering you a chance to live, untethered from the Directorate. Is that not worth the price? His voice was patient, terrifyingly reasonable. He wasn't a monster. He was a logician, and Kalen was trapped in the cold, irrefutable elegance of his argument. He was right. Survival was the ultimate currency. You don't even know my name, Kalen whispered, a last desperate appeal to a humanity he wasn't sure the Alpha possessed. I know your designation, the Alpha countered, his grey eyes softening for a fraction of a second, a fleeting glimpse of something other than granite resolve. And I know the hell you just escaped. That is enough. Names can come later. Survival comes first. My name is Reese. Reese. The name settled into the air, solid and real. It had weight. Unlike 0734, which was a label, a string of characters in a database, Reese was an identity. He had a name, and he had given it freely. It was a small gesture, but in Kalen's barren world, it felt like a seismic shift. He looked at Reese, truly looked at him, past the warrior and the Alpha. He saw the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes, the tension in his broad shoulders. He saw a man who was as much a fugitive as he was, a man who had clawed his way out of the same system and now lived in the shadows it cast. He was not just a captor, he was a survivor, and he was offering Kalen the same. The nascent heat inside him was growing stronger, a persistent, uncomfortable warmth that was beginning to cloud his thoughts. His failing suppressants were not just failing, they were collapsing. Soon, the preheat symptoms would become undeniable. A slick of sweat would form on his skin, his scent would sweeten, becoming an irresistible lure. He would become delirious, lost in the fever of an instinct he had never been allowed to experience. To be caught by the Enclave in that state, the thought was unbearable. They would not see a person in distress. They would see a malfunctioning biological weapon, and they would put it down without a second thought. Reese was offering him a shield, a painful, terrifying, all-encompassing shield, but a shield nonetheless. What would it entail? Kalen asked, his voice trembling. He needed to know the mechanics of it, the cold facts. It was the only way he knew how to process the world. Reese's gaze was direct, leaving no room for illusion. It will be a claim, the bite. It will anchor your scent to mine, weaving them together so tightly that their trackers will read you as part of my territory, or not at all. It will be intense, and for it to hold, to be convincing, it cannot be faked. It must be real. He let the weight of that final word settle. Real. He wasn't just talking about a biological process. He was talking about an act of will, an acceptance. Kalen's hand went instinctively to the scent gland on the side of his neck, a place that had been dormant and numb his entire life. The thought of teeth sinking into that sensitive flesh, of a bond being forced into existence, made him feel sick with a mixture of terror and a strange, shameful anticipation he could not name. His body, so long a stranger to him, was betraying him with a will of its own. It recognized the alpha before him. It recognized the strength, the power, the promise of safety. His mind screamed in protest, but his biology, raw and newly awakened, was whispering a different, more ancient language. He took a shaky breath, the scent of pine and reese filling his lungs. He thought of the white rooms, the cold hands of the medical technicians, the endless hum of the facility. He thought of Director Valerius, her voice like chilled steel, her eyes holding the dispassionate curiosity of a scientist dissecting an insect. He thought of the pain of the neural interface they used to weaponize his latent psychic abilities, the feeling of his own mind being turned into a tool against his will. He was an empath, able to feel the echoes of strong emotion, and they had honed that sensitivity into a fine-edged weapon, forcing him to experience the terror of their enemies until his own identity frayed at the edges. Anything was better than returning to that. Even this. "All right," Kalen breathed, the word a puff of white in the cold night air. It was the first real choice he had ever made, a choice between two different kinds of death, the death of his body or the death of his autonomy. He chose to live. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, crossed Reese's face. He nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of Kalen's decision. He shifted his position, moving from a kneel to sit closer, giving Kalen space, but also creating an undeniable circle of intimacy in the small clearing. The fire from the crash site had begun to die down, and the moon, a sliver of silver in the inky sky, cast long shadows through the trees. "There is no need for it to be violent," Reese said, his voice softer now, stripped of its hard, demanding edge. "It is a right. It should be given, not just taken." The distinction was lost on Kalen. Given, taken. It all felt like a surrender, but he appreciated the sentiment, a small mercy in an impossible situation. He closed his eyes, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He tilted his head to the side, exposing the pale, vulnerable skin of his neck. It was an act of submission so profound it felt like he was flaying himself open. He was offering up the very core of his being, the part of him that the Enclave had tried and failed to extinguish completely. He felt Reese move closer. He could feel the heat radiating from the Alpha's body, a comforting, solid presence in the vast, cold wilderness. A hand, now bare, came to rest on his shoulder. The skin was calloused, but the touch was steady, grounding. It wasn't a clinical touch, not a soldier's grip. It was something else, something personal. Kalen's breath hitched. He waited for the pain, for the sharp tearing of the claim. Instead, he felt Rhys lean in, his breath warm against his ear. The alpha's scent, undiluted and overwhelming, washed over him. It was intoxicating, a complex blend of wood smoke, spice, and the clean scent of rain on stone. It bypassed his conscious thought and spoke directly to the awakening instincts within him. His body trembled, not with fear anymore, but with a strange, terrifying resonance. He felt the rough scrape of Rhys's stubble against his skin as the alpha nuzzled against his scent gland, an ancient, instinctual act of assessment and preparation. A low growl rumbled in Rhys's chest, a sound so deep it vibrated through Kalen's bones. It wasn't a sound of aggression. It was a sound of possession, of profound, absolute claim. And to his horror, a part of him, the deepest, most betrayed part of his Omega self, answered it with a silent, shuddering sigh of acceptance. This was what his body had been built for, what it had craved in a cellular, unconscious way, even through the chemical fog of suppression. "I will not let them take you back," Rhys murmured, his voice a raw promise against Kalen's skin. And in that moment, Kalen understood. This wasn't just about masking a scent. This was an act of defiance. By bonding with Kalen, Rhys was painting a target on his own back. He was taking a directorate asset and making him his own, a direct challenge to the powers that had created them both. It was a rebellion encapsulated in a single, intimate act. The transaction was not as one-sided as he had thought. Rhys was risking himself, too. Then he felt the press of teeth against his neck. They were sharp, a promise of the pain to come. He tensed, his hands clenching into fists in his lap. He waited and waited. But the final piercing bite did not come. Rhys simply held him there, a silent, powerful pressure against his pulse point. A test, a question. He was giving Kalen one last chance to pull away, to rescind his consent. The choice was still his. The realization was a stunning, dizzying revelation. After a lifetime of having no agency, no control, this scarred warrior was offering him a final, crucial choice. He could fight, or he could yield. Kalen took a deep, shaky breath, and, with a will he didn't know he possessed, he relaxed. He let the tension drain from his shoulders, let his head fall more heavily against Rhys's hold. He gave his answer not with words, but with a quiet, complete surrender. A low sound of approval, a soft growl of satisfaction rumbled from Rhys's chest, and then the teeth sank in. The pain was a white-hot, blinding flash, a supernova behind his eyes. It was sharp and deep, a primal, searing violation that stole the air from his lungs. A scream tore from his throat, raw and animalistic. But intertwined with the agony was something else, something unexpected and overwhelming. A rush, a flood of sensation poured through the new connection, a torrent of information and emotion that was not his own. He felt Rhys, not just his physical presence, but the core of him. He felt decades of disciplined control, a loneliness so profound it was like a black hole, a burning, unyielding rage at the system that had scarred him, and beneath it all, a fierce, desperate protectiveness that was now directed entirely at him. It was too much. His own nascent psychic abilities, raw and uncontrolled without the Enclave's technology to focus them, flared in response. He wasn't just receiving Reese's emotions. He was feeling the echo of the forest around them, the fear of a small creature hiding in the brush, the ancient, slow life of the trees. The world exploded into a symphony of feeling, and he was the unprepared conductor at its center. His consciousness fractured. The pain in his neck, the flood of Reese's essence, the cacophony of the wilderness, it all merged into a single, unbearable wave of sensory overload. He felt his own scent, his Omega signature, finally break free from its chemical prison, rising up in a sweet, distressed plume, only to be caught, enveloped, and irrevocably marked by the powerful, smoky scent of the alpha who held him. Their biosignatures clashed, fought, and then, finally, merged, weaving together into a new, singular reality. He felt the bond snap into place, a golden, shimmering thread in the darkness of his mind, anchoring him, claiming him, defining him. And then, mercifully, the darkness took him completely. He drifted back to consciousness slowly, like a swimmer rising from a deep, dark ocean. The first thing he registered was warmth, a steady, enveloping heat that seemed to radiate from his back, a stark contrast to the persistent chill of the night air. He was lying on his side, curled up on a bed of soft pine needles and moss. A thick, insulated cloak, smelling faintly of wood smoke and Reese, was draped over him. He felt safe. The sensation was so foreign, it took him a moment to identify it. For the first time in his memory, he was not being monitored, not being judged, not under the cold, sterile eye of the enclave. He was simply resting. He shifted slightly, and a dull, throbbing ache flared from the side of his neck. He raised a trembling hand to the spot. His fingers brushed against a raised, tender ridge of flesh. The bite, the bond. It was real. A wave of dizziness washed over him as the memories of the previous night came flooding back. The crash, the fire, Reese's demand, the searing pain, and the overwhelming flood of sensation. He could still feel the echo of it, a quiet hum beneath the surface of his skin, a new, permanent connection to the alpha who now slept a few feet away. Reese was sitting with his back against the granite overhang, his head slumped slightly to one side in sleep. His rifle lay across his lap, his hand resting loosely on the stock even in slumber. He looked younger in repose. The harsh lines of his face softened. The weary tension in his shoulders eased. The moonlight traced the silver line of the scar on his cheek, a permanent reminder of a history Kalen could only guess at. He was a fortress, a man built of walls and discipline. Yet through the bond, Kalen had been granted a glimpse inside. He had felt the loneliness, the rage, the flicker of a desperate hope. He was not the cold, unfeeling soldier he projected. He was something far more complex and far more broken, a fresh wave of Kalen's own scent, a soft, muted vanilla and wildflowers pulsed from his skin, triggered by his proximity to the alpha. It was a scent he had never been allowed to have, a part of his identity that had been chemically erased. Now, it was intertwined with Reese's dominant notes of cedar and smoke, a braided cord of two distinct but harmonious aromas. It was the proof of their bond, an olfactory declaration of ownership that would be unmistakable to any tracker, human or machine. He was no longer just 0734, he was Reese's. The thought should have terrified him. It should have felt like the final closing of a cage door. But strangely, it didn't. After a lifetime of being the property of a faceless, sterile institution, being claimed by one person, a person whose pain he had felt, whose strength now shielded him, felt less like imprisonment and more like an anchor, a single, solid point in a chaotic, hostile universe. He sat up slowly, pulling the heavy cloak tighter around his shoulders. The movement, small as it was enough to wake Rhys. The Alpha's eyes snapped open, instantly alert. The transformation was startling. The sleeping man vanished, replaced in a heartbeat by the focused, lethal warrior. His grey eyes scanned the clearing, assessed Kalen, and then, finding no immediate threat, the tension in his body eased fractionally. "How do you feel?" Rhys asked, his voice a low rumble in the pre-dawn quiet. "Sore," Kalen admitted, his voice raspy. He felt more than just sore. He felt different. The world seemed sharper, the colors more vivid. His senses, no longer dulled by suppressants, were operating at a new, heightened level. He could hear the soft scuttling of an insect in the leaves 20 feet away. He could smell the promise of rain on the wind. And he could feel Rhys, a steady, warm presence at the edge of his awareness, a constant hum through their new bond. Rhys nodded, accepting the answer. He pushed himself to his feet, his movements fluid and silent. He offered Kalen a small sealed ration bar and a canteen of water. The bar was dense and tasteless, but it was sustenance, and Kalen ate it gratefully. The water was cool and clean, washing away the metallic taste of fear from his mouth. They ate in silence, a comfortable quiet that was a universe away from the oppressive, mandated silence of the Enclave. "They'll have a recovery team on the ground by sunrise," Rhys said, breaking the quiet. He was checking his rifle, his movements economical and practiced. "The crash site is compromised. We need to move." "Where are we going?" Kalen asked, his voice small. He was completely out of his element, a laboratory specimen set loose in a world he was never meant to inhabit. He was dependent on this stranger for everything. "To a place they can't reach us," Rhys replied, his expression grim. "There are dead zones in this sector, canyons with high-grade ore deposits that scramble their sensors. We can lose them there, but it's a 2-day journey on foot, and they will be hunting." He looked at Kalen, his gaze lingering on the fresh bite mark on his neck. "Our bond will help. It will confuse the initial search. But Valerius, she is persistent. She will not give up on a valuable asset." The name, Valerius, sent a chill down Kalen's spine. Director Valerius was the architect of the Omega Enhancement Program, the cold, brilliant mind who had seen the potential in weaponizing Omega empathy. She was a woman who viewed people as systems to be optimized, emotions as variables to be controlled. She had personally overseen Kalen's development, a presence, a constant, chilling pressure in his life. She would not see his disappearance as a loss. She would see it as a flaw in her system, a problem to be corrected with ruthless efficiency. "She knows what I can do," Kalen said quietly. "She won't just send soldiers. She'll send specialists, psychers." Rhys's hands stilled on his rifle. He looked at Kalen, his eyes narrowing. "Your file was heavily redacted. It listed you as a low-level empath primarily for intelligence gathering, a lie detector." Kalen shook his head, a bitter smile touching his lips. "That was my initial classification. Valerius enhanced me. She used a neural interface to amplify my abilities. I'm not just a passive receiver anymore. I can project. I can touch other minds. It's why they kept me in stasis during transport, to keep me from listening." The confession felt dangerous, like he was handing Reese a weapon that could be used against him. But the bond hummed between them, a conduit of raw, unfiltered truth. He felt a flicker of surprise from Reese, but no fear, no revulsion, only a dawning, grim understanding. "So you're not just a beacon they're tracking by scent," Reese murmured, his gaze intense. "You're a psychic resonator, a weapon that's gone missing." He cursed under his breath, a sharp, violent sound. "This complicates things." He looked up at the lightening sky, a pale grey band on the horizon. "We need to move, now." The journey was a brutal education in survival. Reese moved through the dense forest with a speed and certainty that was breathtaking. He was a part of this wilderness as much as the trees and the rocks. Kalen, on the other hand, was a liability. His muscles, atrophied from years of confinement and stasis, screamed in protest. His soft-soled facility slippers were no match for the rough terrain. Within the first hour, his feet were bruised and bleeding. He stumbled constantly, his senses still overwhelmed by the sheer, chaotic vitality of the world around him. Reese was patient, but his patience had a hard, pragmatic edge. He pushed Kalen relentlessly, allowing only brief, infrequent stops for water. He taught him how to walk silently, how to read the signs of the trail, how to distinguish the call of a bird from a hunter's signal. Kalen was a clumsy, inept student, but he was a desperate one. Every snapped twig, every dislodged stone felt like a broadcast of their position to the hunters he knew were following. By midday, Kalen was on the verge of collapse. His legs trembled with exhaustion, and his lungs burned with every breath. He tripped over a root, his ankle twisting painfully, and went down hard. He lay there, gasping on the forest floor, the smell of damp earth filling his nostrils. He didn't have the strength to get up. He had failed. He was a liability, just as the Enclave had always told him he would be without their support systems. He felt a presence loom over him. He expected a harsh word, a frustrated command to get up. Instead, Reese knelt beside him, his expression unreadable. He gently took Kalen's foot, his large, calloused hands surprisingly careful as he examined the swelling ankle. Kalen flinched at the contact, still unaccustomed to being touched. "It's not broken, but you can't put your full weight on it," Reese said, his voice flat. He looked at Kalen, his grey eyes seeming to see right through the layers of pain and exhaustion, into the core of his despair. "I know this is difficult. You were kept in a cage, and now you're being asked to run a marathon. Your body is not conditioned for this." "I'm slowing you down," Kalen whispered, shame and frustration making his voice thick. "You should leave me. You'd move faster alone." It was the logical, tactical solution. It was what the Enclave would do. Cut the dead weight, sacrifice the compromised asset. Reese's jaw tightened. "I do not abandon my own," he said, his voice low and fierce. The words struck Kalen with the force of a physical blow. My own. Through the bond, he felt a powerful, surging wave of protectiveness from the Alpha, so intense it was almost painful. It was a raw, primal declaration, and it left no room for argument. He was not an asset to be discarded. He was Reese's, and Reese did not abandon what was his. Without another word, Reese reached into his pack and pulled out a roll of medical wrap. He expertly bound Kalen's ankle, the pressure firm and supportive. Then he stood and pulled Kalen to his feet, taking on most of his weight. "Lean on me," he commanded. He draped Kalen's arm over his shoulders, his own arm circling Kalen's waist in a grip of iron. They began to move again, Kalen half limping, half supported by the unyielding strength of the alpha beside him. The physical contact was a constant, dizzying reality. He was pressed against Reese's side, the heat of the alpha's body seeping into his own. He could feel the play of muscle under Reese's shirt, the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart. The combined scent of them, the Omega's soft vanilla and the Alpha's smoky cedar, created a small, mobile bubble of intimacy in the vast, hostile wilderness. It was disorienting and deeply, terrifyingly comforting. He was leaning on the man who had claimed him, dependent on him for every step. The lines of their transactional agreement were blurring, replaced by something more complex, something Kalen had no words for. He was not just a payment, he was a partner in this desperate flight, and Reese was not just his owner, he was his shield. And as they moved deeper into the shadows of the canyons, with the invisible hunters of the Enclave drawing ever closer, Kalen realized that he was beginning to trust the man who had taken his bond by force. It was an illogical, dangerous trust, but it was the only thing he had left. The second day of their journey bled into a grueling rhythm of pain and endurance. Kalen's world shrank to the circle of his immediate senses, the burning ache in his muscles, the solid presence of Reese at his side, the constant, low-level thrum of their bond. The connection was a strange and mutable thing. At times, it was a source of comfort, a silent conversation that flowed between them, a shared awareness of their surroundings. At other times, it was an intrusion, a raw feed of Reese's disciplined anxiety and Kalen's own flickering fear, amplifying each other in a feedback loop of quiet desperation. He learned to build small walls in his mind, a trick the Enclave had inadvertently taught him to mute the flow when it became overwhelming. They were deeper in the canyons now, the forest giving way to towering walls of red rock and scree. The air grew thinner, colder. Reese pointed to the strata of dark, metallic ore veining the canyon walls. Sensor-grade cobalt, he explained, his voice a low murmur. It creates a magnetic field that scrambles most long-range sensors, drones, thermal imaging, even psychic resonance. It all gets distorted in here. It's our best chance to disappear. It was also a trap. The canyons offered limited routes of escape. If the Enclave's hunters managed to corner them here, there would be nowhere to run. They were trading the risk of detection for the risk of entrapment. Every choice was a gamble. Late in the afternoon, as they navigated a narrow, treacherous ledge, Kalen felt a sudden, sharp spike of alarm through the bond. It wasn't Reese's. It was an external echo, a psychic ripple that cut through the background noise of the wilderness. He froze, his hand tightening on Reese's arm. "They're close," he whispered, his heart leaping into his throat. Down canyon, 4 of them. Their minds. They're cold. Disciplined. Reese didn't question him. He instantly pulled Kalen back, flattening them both into a shallow alcove in the rock face. He drew his rifle, his movements economical and silent. He peered over the edge of the rock, his storm-grey eyes scanning the terrain below. "I don't see them," he breathed, his voice barely audible. "You won't," Kalen said, squeezing his eyes shut as he focused on the psychic disturbance. "They're shielded. Phase cloak technology. But I can feel the pressure of their minds. It's like 4 empty spaces where there should be life. It's the Enclave's Psyker Kill team." He had only encountered them in simulations, but the signature was unmistakable. They were hunters trained to track and neutralize psychic assets, their own minds shielded and honed into precision weapons. Reese cursed under his breath. Phase cloaks made them invisible to the naked eye and thermal sensors. They were ghosts, and they were closing in. How close? Reese demanded. Kalen reached out with his own fractured empathy, pushing past the static of the cobalt-laced rock. It was like wading through thick mud. He felt the 4 cold spots moving in a coordinated pattern, sweeping the canyon floor. 500 meters. They're moving fast. They haven't pinpointed us yet, but they're sweeping the area. They were trapped. To go forward would be to walk into them. To go back would be to lose the cover of the canyons. Reese's mind was a maelstrom of tactical calculations, scenarios playing out and being discarded in fractions of a second. Kalen could feel the cold, hard logic of the soldier, but beneath it he felt a deeper, more visceral current, a fierce, unyielding refusal to be caught, a refusal to let Kalen be caught. "There's a cave system," Reese said, his voice tight. "An old mining tunnel, about 50 meters back the way we came. It's not on any directorate maps. If we can get there, we can wait them out." It was their only option. They had to retreat, to hide, and to pray the hunters passed them by. Moving backward along the narrow ledge was a nightmare. Every step was a risk, every dislodged pebble a potential death sentence. Kalen's injured ankle throbbed with a fiery pain, and he had to bite his lip to keep from crying out. Reese was a rock, a solid wall of support, his strength the only thing keeping Kalen on his feet. The cold spots in Kalen's mind were getting closer, their psychic pressure growing. They knew something was here. They were converging on their position. They reached the entrance to the mine just as Kalen felt the first direct psychic probe. It was a delicate, needle-like touch against his mental shields, a question being asked in a language of pure thought. "Are you there?" he gasped, stumbling, the mental contact a shocking violation. Reese shoved him into the darkness of the tunnel mouth. "Go, all the way to the back," he ordered, turning to face the entrance, his rifle raised. Kalen scrambled into the oppressive dark of the mine. The air was stale, thick with the smell of dust and cold stone. He fumbled his way along the rough-hewn wall, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He could feel the hunters getting closer, their mental presence a growing, chilling weight. He reached the end of the short tunnel and collapsed, pressing himself against the back wall, trying to make himself as small as possible. Reese backed into the entrance, his silhouette a dark shape against the grey light of the canyon. He didn't activate a light source, relying on his own enhanced senses. He was a shadow, waiting for other shadows. Kalen could feel the shift in him through the bond. The protector, the guide, had vanished. In his place was the killer, the ghost. His entire being was focused into a single point of lethal intent. The loneliness and pain were still there, but they were banked, hidden behind a wall of pure, cold, combat focus. The psychic probes grew more insistent, more forceful. They were trying to get a lock on him. Kalen closed his eyes, focusing all his energy on the mental shields the Enclave had taught him to build. They were designed to hide, not to fight. He pictured a wall of smooth, black glass, reflecting everything, absorbing nothing. The probes slid off, unable to gain purchase, but it was taking all of his concentration, and he could feel the strain, a building pressure behind his eyes. One of the hunters was close, just outside the mine entrance. Kalen felt its cold, empty mind brush against the opening, a predator sniffing at a rabbit hole. There was a flicker of suspicion, a mental ping as it sensed the disturbance in the air. Through his bond with Reese, Kalen felt the alpha's muscles tense, his trigger finger tightening. He was waiting for the perfect moment. And then Kalen had an idea, a desperate, reckless idea born from a flash of memory. A training exercise where Director Valerius had demonstrated how a powerful empath could not just read emotion, but project it, create a psychic illusion. He had never been able to do it. The neural interface had been required to focus his power to that degree. But now, without the interface, his power was raw, untamed, and perhaps more potent. The bond with Reese was an anchor, a focal point. Maybe it was enough. He reached out, not with his shields, but with his core ability. He didn't try to fight the hunter's mind. He tried to deceive it. He gathered up the ambient feelings of the canyon, the coldness of the rock, the emptiness of the air, the slow, geologic patience of the mountain, and he projected it. He wrapped the entrance of the cave in a psychic blanket of nothing. There is nothing here, he thought, pouring all his will into the illusion. Just empty rock, cold stone. Move on. He felt the hunter's mental presence hesitate. The probing needle wavered, confused. It brushed against his illusion, and for a terrifying second, Kalen thought it would push through. But his projection, fueled by desperation and anchored by Reese's steady, focused presence, held firm. The hunter perceived only what Kalen wanted it to, an empty, uninteresting hole in the rock. After a long, agonizing moment, the cold spot in Kalen's mind moved on, continuing its sweep down the canyon. One by one, the other three followed, their psychic signatures fading into the distance. The moment they were gone, Kalen's concentration shattered. The mental effort had been immense. A wave of vertigo and nausea washed over him, and he slumped against the wall, gasping. A trickle of blood ran from his nose. Through the bond, he felt a surge of alarm and concern from Reese. The alpha was at his side in an instant, kneeling in the darkness. A hand, calloused and sure, touched his cheek, wiping away the blood. "What did you do?" Reese asked, his voice a low, rough whisper in the dark. "I made them think the cave was empty," Kalen breathed, his head spinning. I hid us." There was a long silence. The darkness in the mine was absolute, a thick, velvety blackness that swallowed all light. But Kalen didn't need to see. He could feel Reese's reaction through the bond. It was a complex, potent mix of awe, shock, and a dawning, terrifying realization. The Enclave hadn't just been lying about Kalen being a low-level empath. They had been lying about the very limits of his power. He wasn't just a lie detector. He wasn't just a tracking device. He was a psychic powerhouse, capable of bending perception itself. "Valerius wasn't enhancing you," Reese said, his voice filled with a new, grim understanding. "She was containing you. The neural interface, the suppressants. It was all to keep you under control, to keep you from realizing what you could really do." The implication was staggering. Kalen had always seen himself as a flawed tool, a defective piece of equipment that required constant maintenance and calibration by the Enclave. He had believed their narrative, that he was weak, unstable, and dangerous without their guidance. But what if the opposite was true? What if he was powerful, and they were the ones who were afraid? Afraid of what he might become if he was ever free. In the suffocating darkness of the mine, hidden deep in the bones of the earth, a new, terrifying, and exhilarating thought took root in Kalen's mind. The Enclave had made him a weapon, but they had made a critical mistake. They had forgotten to remove his will. And now, for the first time, he was beginning to understand the true nature of the power they had tried so hard to cage. He was not just a runaway asset. He was a ghost in their machine, and he was finally learning how to haunt them. Reese's hand was still on his cheek, a warm, solid anchor in the disorienting dark. He was not alone. The warrior who had claimed him, the alpha who had bound him, was now his accomplice. Their flight for survival had just become the first quiet act of a rebellion. They remained in the utter blackness of the mine for what felt like an eternity. Time lost its meaning, measured only by the slow return of Kalen's strength and the steady, reassuring rhythm of Reese's breathing beside him. The alpha never strayed more than an arm's length away, a silent, watchful sentinel. The intimacy of their shared darkness was profound. Without sight, their other senses sharpened. The bond between them became the primary mode of communication, a constant, silent stream of reassurance and shared vigilance. Kalen could feel Reese's disciplined calm, a stark contrast to the frantic, terrified fluttering of his own heart as it slowly settled. He learned more about Reese in that silent darkness than he ever could have from words. He felt the echoes of the man's past, not as clear memories, but as emotional scars. There was a phantom pain in Reese's left knee, a memory of an old, brutal injury. There was a deep, aching grief for a face Kalen couldn't see, a name he didn't know, a loss so profound it had carved a permanent hollow inside the alpha. And beneath it all, there was the burning, righteous fury of betrayal. The Enclave hadn't just used him as a soldier. They had taken something from him, something irreplaceable. His fight was not just for freedom. It was for revenge. Kalen realized that Reese hadn't just saved him out of some abstract sense of kinship. He had seen a fellow victim, yes, but he had also seen a weapon he could turn back against their shared enemy. "Your file designated you A217, Kalen said quietly into the dark, the words seeming to hang in the still air. It wasn't a question. It was a piece of data he'd pulled from the faint psychic residue Reese projected. The ghost of Sector Gamma, the alpha who single-handedly dismantled the Orion outpost. You were listed as KIA. He felt a jolt of surprise from Reese, a tightening of his mental shields. "My file is sealed at the highest level. How do you know that?" "I see things sometimes," Kalen admitted. "Echoes, when I'm close to someone, especially now, with the bond." He was afraid he had overstepped, pried into a place he wasn't welcome. But the defensiveness from Reese quickly faded, replaced by a weary resignation. "A217 is dead," Reese said, his voice flat. "He died on Orion. I am what's left." The finality in his tone was chilling. He had killed his old self, his directorate designation, and reforged his identity in the fires of his own rebellion. Kalen understood the impulse perfectly. He longed to do the same, to burn away 0734 until nothing remained but ash. "They told us you were a traitor," Kalen continued, unable to stop himself. "That you broke your conditioning and slaughtered your own unit." A bitter, humorless laugh echoed softly in the mine. "Half-truths, the most effective kind of lie. I did break my conditioning, and I did kill them, but they weren't my unit anymore. They were following an order to sanitize a civilian settlement that had been exposed to a biological agent we were field testing, an agent the Directorate released intentionally." The confession was stark, stripped of any justification. It was a simple, ugly fact. They were ordered to kill men, women, children. I gave them a choice: stand down or die. They chose poorly. The cold, brutal calculus of it settled over Kalen. This was the man who had claimed him, a man who had made an impossible choice and had been living with the consequences ever since. He was not a hero in a storybook. He was a killer, a survivor, a man who operated by his own harsh code of ethics in a world that had none. And he had chosen to save Kalen. He had chosen to bind himself to an unknown, unstable Omega asset and drag him into his own private war. "Why me?" Kalen asked, the question that had been haunting him since the crash. "You could have left me. It would have been safer for you." Reese was silent for a long time. Kalen could feel the conflict in him, the weighing of words. "When I touched your pod," he finally said, his voice low and rough with an emotion Kalen couldn't quite name. "I felt something. Not with my mind. It was instinct. The same feeling I had on Orion, right before the world went to hell. A feeling that something was profoundly wrong, and that you were at the center of it. And then I saw your designation, 0734. I knew your program, Valerius's pet project. I knew she was creating something new, something dangerous. Leaving you for them to recover was not an option. Letting them kill you was not an option. You were the key to burning her entire system to the ground. So that was it. The cold, tactical reason. Kalen was a key, a weapon. It should have felt familiar, a return to his old reality of being an asset. But it didn't. Because Reese's words, his logic, were at war with the steady, protective warmth Kalen could feel radiating from him through the bond. The soldier had a mission, but the man had an instinct, and the two had converged on Kalen. He was not just a tool for Reese's revenge. He was something more, something Reese himself did not yet seem to understand. "And the bond," Kalen whispered. "Was that just tactics too? To hide me?" Another long pause. The darkness seemed to press in, heavy with the unspoken truth. At first, Reese admitted, his voice barely audible. It was the most logical way to guarantee your immediate survival and concealment. A necessary measure. He shifted in the dark, the sound of his gear a soft scrape against the rock. "It is no longer just that." The admission was grudging, forced from a place of deep-seated control. Through the bond, Kalen felt a confusing, powerful surge of possessiveness, of a fierce, unwilling tenderness that Reese was trying and failing to suppress. The bond was not a one-way street. It was changing the alpha too, cracking open the fortress he had built around himself. Before Kalen could process this, a new sensation pricked at his awareness, a faint, distant vibration. He sat up, his head tilting. "Something's coming," he said. It wasn't the psychic cold of the hunters. This was different, a rhythmic, mechanical thrumming that he could feel in his teeth. Reese was already on his feet, moving silently toward the mine entrance. The thrumming grew louder, resolving into the unmistakable sound of heavy transport engines. "They're deploying an armor unit," Reese hissed, peering out. "They've given up on stealth. They're going to level this entire canyon if they have to." The hunters had failed, so Valerius was escalating. She was bringing overwhelming force to bear. There would be no more hiding. Kalen felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. They were trapped. The mine would become their tomb. "There might be another way out," Reese said, his voice tight with urgency. Old mines like this are often connected. Ventilation shafts, deeper tunnels. He activated a low-intensity light on his rifle, the sudden beam cutting a sharp, narrow cone through the absolute black. The light revealed the rough, damp walls of the tunnel, the floor littered with rubble. It also revealed a dark, narrow opening at the back of the chamber that they hadn't seen before, partially obscured by a rockfall. It was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through Kalen. He followed Reese, who began pulling rocks away from the opening, his movements swift and powerful. The air that wafted from the hole was even more stale, ancient and undisturbed. The thrum of the transports was growing louder now, the ground beginning to vibrate beneath their feet. They didn't have much time. They cleared enough of the opening for them to slip through. The tunnel on the other side was smaller, a natural fissure that had been crudely widened by miners long ago. It sloped steeply downward into the deep, dark heart of the mountain. "Stay close," Reese ordered, taking the lead. "Don't touch the walls if you can help it. These old shafts can be unstable." They descended into the earth, the sounds of the Enclave forces fading behind them, replaced by the dripping of water and the scuttling of unseen things in the dark. The air grew warmer, more humid. The single beam of Reese's light cut a nervous, dancing path ahead of them. This was a different kind of fear. Not the fear of the hunter, but the fear of the unknown, of being buried alive. Kalen's breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. The walls felt like they were closing in. His ingrained aversion to small, enclosed spaces, a product of a life spent in sterile, controlled rooms, was triggering a wave of claustrophobia. He stumbled, his hand flying out to brace himself against the wall. His fingers brushed against something cold, smooth, and metallic embedded in the rock. It was a data port, an old, corroded Directorate data port. He stared at it, his mind reeling. What was it doing here, in a mine that was supposedly abandoned long before the Enclave's rise? "Reese," he said, his voice tight. Reese stopped, turning back. He shone the light on the port. His eyes widened slightly. "This mine wasn't for cobalt," he murmured, a dawning horror in his voice. He ran the beam of light along the walls. Here and there, Kalen could now see other signs of the Enclave's presence. Corroded conduits, a shattered piece of plasteel with a Directorate logo, barely visible under a layer of grime. This was a black site, Reese breathed. A research outpost, one of the first ones. They buried it, literally. A cold dread, far worse than the fear of the hunters above, began to creep up Kalen's spine. What had they been researching down here? What kind of horrors had the Enclave buried so deep in the earth? He reached out with his psychic sense, tentatively at first, and then with more force. He had expected to feel nothing but the cold, empty rock. Instead, he felt echoes, faint, ghostly whispers of immense pain and terror, soaked into the very stone around them. It was a psychic graveyard. The place screamed with the ghosts of 1,000 silent agonies. Staggered back, a cry catching in his throat, his hands flying to his head to block out the overwhelming tide of spectral emotion. He had stumbled out of one of Valerius's labs and into the ruins of another, one far older and perhaps far more terrible. The bond flared, and he felt Reese's alarm, his confusion. The Alpha grabbed his shoulders, his grip a firm, grounding pressure. "Kalen, what is it? What do you feel?" "Pain," Kalen choked out, tears streaming down his face. "So much pain. They did things here, To people like me, they were trying to create something, to force the psychic gene. This is where it all started. He looked at Reese, his eyes wide with horror. This isn't a mine, it's a tomb. And they had just locked themselves inside it. Outside, the hunters. Below, the ghosts of the Enclave's first sins. There was no escape. There was only a descent into the forgotten nightmares of the past. The psychic residue of the black site was a constant, agonizing pressure at the edges of Kalen's consciousness. The ghostly screams and whispers of long-dead test subjects were a relentless tide of suffering that threatened to overwhelm his fragile shields. He clung to the bond with Reese, using the Alpha's solid, living presence as a lighthouse in a sea of spectral misery. Reese, in turn, seemed to sense his distress, his physical proximity becoming a constant, reassuring anchor. He never let go of Kalen's hand as they navigated the deeper tunnels, his warm, solid grip a barrier against the encroaching ghosts. The tunnels opened into a vast, cavernous space. It was a laboratory, a ruined, ancient version of the sterile environments Kalen knew, but unmistakable. Rusted medical tables stood like skeletal remains. Shattered glass from specimen jars littered the floor. And everywhere, the faint, unmistakable logo of the early Enclave Directorate. In the center of the cavern was a massive, cylindrical containment unit, its thick plasteel walls cracked and clouded with age. Wires and conduits snaked from it, connecting to a bank of corroded computer terminals. Project Chimera, Reese breathed, his light playing over a faded, peeling stencil on the side of the containment unit. I thought it was a myth, a ghost story they told new recruits to ensure obedience. He looked at Kalen, his face grim in the stark light. The Directorate's first attempt at creating a perfect psychic weapon. They tried to splice and graft psychic abilities from multiple subjects into a single host. The project was a catastrophic failure. The subjects, they didn't survive the process. Or so the story went. Kalen's gaze was fixed on the containment unit. He could feel something from within it. Not the frantic, chaotic pain of the echoes in the tunnels, but something singular. A deep, slow, patient consciousness, slumbering in the dark. It was a mind of immense power, but it was fractured, broken into 1,000 glittering shards. "It's not empty," Kalen whispered, a tremor of fear and awe in his voice. "There's someone in there. They're alive." Reese immediately raised his rifle, his soldier's instincts taking over. "Impossible. This facility has been sealed for over 50 years. They put them in stasis," Kalen said, his own psychic sense feeding him fragments of information from the slumbering mind. But the system failed. Not completely. It's been keeping them in a state between life and death, dreaming. He took a step closer, drawn by a strange, compelling fascination. The mind within was like a shattered mirror, each piece reflecting a different facet of a powerful personality. And within that fractured consciousness, he felt a flicker of recognition, a resonance. It was an omega of unimaginable psychic strength. Suddenly, the computer terminals flickered to life, their screens glowing with a sickly green light. A single line of text appeared on every monitor. "Greetings, 0734. Kalen froze, the blood turning to ice in his veins. The voice that echoed in his head was not digital. It was a psychic whisper, ancient and powerful, coming directly from the containment unit. It was the sleeping Omega. "We have been waiting for you." Reese grabbed Kalen, pulling him back. "It's a trap." "No," Kalen said, his eyes wide. It's not a trap. It's a welcome. He could feel the intent from the being in the tank. There was no malice, only a profound, bottomless loneliness and a desperate, yearning curiosity. "You are like us," the voice whispered in his mind, the plural pronoun unsettling. "A key, but you are unlocked. You walk free." The text on the screens changed. A complex schematic appeared, showing the facility's power grid, its life support systems, and its self-destruct sequence. "They buried us," the voice continued, a new cold anger seeping into its tone. "They could not control us, so they left us to rot in the dark." Director Valerius. She was a junior researcher then. This was her first failure, her first sin. The name hit them both like a physical blow. Valerius. She hadn't just built on the directorate's research. She had been there at the beginning. This place, this tomb, was her legacy. She wasn't just hunting a lost asset. She was burying her own history. "She is coming," the being in the tank projected. "Her signature is on the surface. She will not allow this place to be rediscovered. She will sterilize this entire canyon." On the main screen, the self-destruct sequence timer began to count down. 30 minutes. "It's triggering the self-destruct," Reese said, his voice tight, "to keep Valerius from getting her hands on whatever is in there. And on us." "We cannot leave," the voice confirmed, a wave of profound sadness washing over Kalen. "Our body is too degraded, but you can. There is a service tunnel. It leads to the surface, kilometers from here, beyond her perimeter." A new schematic appeared, highlighting a hidden passage behind the bank of terminals. "We can delay her. We will show her a ghost of our power. It will draw her attention. It will give you time." It was a sacrifice. The first Omega, the failed experiment, was offering them their only chance of escape, at the cost of its own final destruction. Kalen felt a powerful surge of empathy, a kinship with the lonely, fractured mind in the tank. They were both victims of the same cold, ruthless ambition. "Why?" Kalen asked, the question a silent thought directed at the being. "Why help us?" The answer was simple and devastating. "You are free. Go. Live. Be the legacy she could not bury." A powerful wave of psychic energy erupted from the containment unit. It wasn't directed at them, but upwards, through solid rock, a massive psychic scream that would be an unmissable beacon to Valerius and her hunters on the surface. The lights in the cavern flickered violently. The ground shook. The ancient Omega was expending the last of its energy to buy them time. "We have to go. Now!" Reese yelled, pulling a stunned Kalen toward the hidden passage. They scrambled through the opening, into another narrow tunnel. Behind them, they could hear the groan of stressed metal as the ancient laboratory began to tear itself apart. The countdown was accelerating. They ran, fueled by adrenaline and desperation, through the winding service tunnel. It was a steep, upward climb, their lungs burning, their muscles screaming. Kalen could no longer feel the presence of the Omega behind them. The powerful mind that had lingered for 50 years in the dark had finally gone silent. It had given its own ghost to save them. They emerged from the tunnel into the cold, clear light of dusk, gasping for air. They were on a high ridge, far from the canyon they had entered. In the distance, they could see the faint glow of searchlights and the dark, insect-like shapes of Enclave transports. They were miles away, focused on the location of the old mine, drawn in by the psychic lure. And then, the world went white. A silent, brilliant flash erupted from the direction of the canyons, followed seconds later by a deep, earth-shattering roar that echoed through the mountains. The ground beneath their feet bucked violently. Kayleen and Reese were thrown to the ground, shielding their heads as a wave of superheated air and dust washed over them. The self-destruct sequence had completed. The black site and all of the Enclave's secrets and ghosts within it had been vaporized, erased from existence, and with it, any evidence that they had ever been there. To Valerius, it would look like they had been caught in the blast. They were officially dead. Again, Kalen lay on the rocky ground, his ears ringing, his body trembling from shock and exhaustion. He looked over at Reese, who was pushing himself up, his face covered in dust, his grey eyes fixed on the pillar of smoke rising in the distance. They were alive. They were free. For now. The cost of that freedom had been the sacrifice of a soul they had never met, a forgotten victim of the same system that had created them. The bond between them hummed, no longer a source of tension or a tactical necessity, but a quiet, shared current of grief and grim triumph. Reese looked at Kalen, his expression stripped of all its usual walls. In his eyes, Kalen saw not a soldier assessing a weapon, but a man seeing an equal, a partner, a survivor. "It's over," Kalen whispered, the words feeling inadequate. "No," Reese said, his voice raw. He reached out a hand, not to command, but to offer. "It's just beginning." Kalen looked at the offered hand, calloused and steady. He thought of the cold, sterile rooms of the Enclave, of the pain of the neural interface, of the silent, lonely agony of the Omega in the tank. He thought of the name he had almost forgotten. Kalen. He was not O734. He was not an asset. He was not an experiment. He was Kalen. And he was finally, terrifyingly, free. He placed his hand in Reese's. The grip was firm. A promise. Together, they rose to their feet, two ghosts reborn from the fire, and turned their backs on the smoking ruins of their past, ready to face the uncertain future they had just bought with borrowed time and a stranger's sacrifice. Their war was far from over. But for the first time, they were not fighting alone.